The academy required all cadets to disarm. He still entered, armed. There are rules that exist because they need to, and there are rules that exist because the beings who wrote them never imagined an exception. The Galactic War Academy had one rule above all others. One rule that predated every other regulation in its 8,000-year history. One rule that had survived regime changes and political restructurings, and 3 separate complete overhauls of the Academy's curriculum and doctrine. One rule that every species, every civilization, every cadet from every corner of the known galaxy had complied with without exception since the day the Academy opened its doors. No weapons beyond the gate. Not a suggestion. Not a guideline. Not one of those rules that exists on paper and is understood by everyone to have reasonable exceptions in reasonable circumstances. A law. Absolute. Non-negotiable. The foundational principle on which the entire concept of the Academy rested. That this was neutral ground, that here, for the duration of training, the weapons that the galaxy's species used against each other were set aside, and what remained was the business of learning. 8,000 years. Thousands of graduating classes. Species that had been at war with each other for centuries, learning in the same halls, eating in the same mess, training in the same rings, because the weapons were at the gate, and without the weapons the hatred had nothing to grip. The rule had never failed. Until the scanner screamed. The sound was not an alert. Alerts had a tone, a measured, professional tone calibrated to communicate. Urgency without panic. To tell the trained personnel who heard it that something required attention without suggesting that the something was beyond the facility's capacity to handle. This was not that. This was the sound of a system encountering something it had not been designed to encounter and expressing that encounter in the only register available to it. Shrill. Escalating. The specific quality of noise that security systems produce when every threshold they have been configured to monitor is being exceeded simultaneously, and the software responsible for translating that data into output has, essentially, lost its composure. It ripped through the marble halls of the Academy's entry processional like something physical, bouncing off the high-vaulted ceilings, off the banners that had watched 10,000 graduating classes march, past them over 8,000 years of history, off the polished floors and the carved stone archways, and every surface of a building that had been designed for ceremony and authority, and had never, in its entire existence, hosted a sound quite like this one. Cadets froze, mid-step, mid-conversation, mid the ordinary business of a processing day at the beginning of a new Academy cycle. Hundreds of beings from dozens of species, in the middle of the specific bureaucratic choreography of arrival and registration and orientation, all of it stopping all at once, as the sound hit. Instructors stiffened. The automated security, turrets, positioned at intervals along the processional, their presence more symbolic than practical in a facility where the rule meant that nothing requiring a turret's attention was supposed to exist, rotated, acquired a target, then hesitated, because the targeting system's threat assessment protocols were producing outputs that didn't match any category in their decision tree. At the center of the entry hall, one human, standing still, hands visible, at his sides, expression. And this was the part that the beings nearest to him would remember afterward, because it was the part that didn't fit. Calm. Not the performed calm of someone maintaining composure under pressure. Not the stillness of someone frozen by surprise or fear, just calm. The way a person is calm when they are in a situation they have been in before and have a clear sense of how it resolves. The drill master covered the distance between them in the specific way that Corthian military instructors cover distances, quickly, with the physical authority of a species that had been apex predators on their homeworld for long enough that the posture of dominance was structural rather than chosen. Mandibles flared, the full presence of several centuries of military experience directed at a single point, cadet. The voice filled the hall the way the sound had filled it, but with intent behind it. You were ordered to disarm before entry. Explain yourself. The human glanced at the scanner. The scanner, as if in response to being looked at, reached a new peak in its wailing. He looked back at the drill master, I did, he said. The hall, which had been in the process of remembering how to breathe, stopped again. The drill master's mandibles clicked. The scanner. I know what the scanner is doing, the human said. I disarmed. I don't have external weapons. I don't have concealed tools. I submitted to the full intake process. A pause. The scanner is not detecting weapons. Then what? The drill master said very carefully. Is it detecting? The human's expression did something that the translator systems rendered as a complex combination of resignation and mild amusement. Me, he said. His name was Elias Rowan, 23 years old by Earth's calendar, the product of a childhood spent in one of the agricultural regions of Earth's northern continent, where the specific combination of high gravity and outdoor physical work in a family that had been doing physical outdoor work in high gravity for generations had produced, in the standard biological packaging of a human male, something that the Academy's intake scanner was currently describing in terms that were making several nearby cadets visibly reconsider their proximity. He had applied to the Galactic War Academy through the standard process, passed the written examinations with scores that placed him in the top 12% of his intake cohort, passed the psychological evaluation with a profile that the assessing officer had noted as unusually stable under simulated stress conditions, passed the physical evaluation with scores that had required the Academy's medical staff to double-check the equipment 3 times before accepting the results as accurate. He had arrived on processing day with a single standard-issue cadet kit, bag in the awareness, developed over 23 years of being human in a galaxy that was still developing its understanding of what that meant, that the intake scanner was going to be a conversation. It was always a conversation. The security drones descended. 12 of them, in a formation that was less tactical than symbolic. The Academy's security protocols were designed for deterrence as much as response, and 12 drones in a tight ring communicated a very specific message about the seriousness with which the facility regarded the current situation. Cadet Rowan, the security system announced, through speakers that were significantly more composed than the scanner had been. Please identify all concealed armaments for voluntary disclosure prior to forced scan. Elias looked at the drones. I don't have concealed armaments, he said. The scanner has identified significant weapons-grade biological signatures, the system replied. Please comply. The scanner, Elias said, is technically correct, but it's also not detecting weapons. He paused. The distinction matters. The drill master stepped closer. You will explain yourself, he said. The volume was lower now, more controlled, which was somehow more significant. Immediately and completely. Elias looked around the hall at the frozen cadets, the stiff instructors, the turret still pointing at him with the hesitant quality of systems that had been given contradictory instructions and were waiting for something to resolve the contradiction, at the banners of 8,000 years of Academy history. Biology, he said. The silence lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then the laughter started. Not all of it was cruel. Some of it was genuine confusion expressing itself in the only register available. The nervous laughter of beings encountering something unexpected and defaulting to dismissal because dismissal was more comfortable than engagement. But some of it was the sharper variety. The laughter that is about establishing position, about communicating to the being laughed at where they stand in the room's hierarchy. An avian cadet from the Thesivian delegation clicked his beak, a sound that translated through the Academy's ambient interpreter systems as something between amusement and contempt. The human is declaring himself a weapon. Is that what's happening? A Vraxian, one of the armored species whose natural carapace had required the installation of inhibitor fields for Academy compliance, flexed the plates along his shoulders. Humans exaggerate. It's documented. This is theater. More laughter. Spreading outward, Elias said nothing. The drill master's voice cut through it. Enough. The hall settled. Human. You will disarm completely. Whatever biological systems you are claiming are not covered by the standard exemption protocols. If your body is registering as a weapons system, you will take whatever steps are necessary to bring it into compliance. I can't, Elias said. The laughter was gone. I can't, he said again, in the same tone, not defiant, not dramatic, stating a fact. Not because I'm refusing to comply with the rule, because what the scanner is detecting cannot be removed. It's not a weapon I'm carrying. It's what I am. The drill master stared at him. You think yourself above Academy law? No, Elias said. I think the rule was written by species who could comply with it. I think the beings who wrote it never considered what it would mean to ask a species to remove its own biology. He looked at the scanner, which had settled, into a sustained wail rather than its earlier peaks, but had shown no signs of stopping. I think there's a distinction between a weapon and a weapons-capable organism, and I think that distinction matters for how the rule applies. The hall was very still. I'm not above the rule, Elias said. I'm asking you to understand what the rule actually covers. She arrived the way senior officers arrive, without announcement, without the preliminary communication that subordinates use to prepare for authority. Simply present in the way that things that have been doing something for a very long time are present. There and then there. The transition between absent and present so smooth it was difficult to point to the exact moment. The senior instructor was old. Old in the way that military beings get old when they have survived everything their career threw at them. Not fragile, not diminished, but marked. Scarred, in the literal sense, and in the deeper sense of something that has processed a great deal and carries the weight of the processing without being bent by it. Her eyes went to Elias, to the scanner, to the drones, and the drill master, and the several hundred frozen cadets beyond. What's the delay? She said. The human refuses to disarm, the drill master said. He claims the scanner is detecting his biology rather than weapons. He is claiming exemption on the basis that his body itself constitutes the armament. She looked at him for a long moment, then at Elias. You're human, she said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite recognition. More like the arrival at a conclusion she had been approaching for the last 30 seconds. Of course, she said quietly. She turned to the drill master. He was already preparing his response. The specific posture of a subordinate who is confident in their position and is ready to defend it. You're asking him, she said before he could speak, to remove what he is. The drill master's mandibles shifted. Every species disarms before entry. It is the foundational rule of this institution. It has never had exceptions. It cannot have exceptions because every species disarms, she said. Because every species can. She let that sit. Humans cannot. The confusion that moved through the hall had a different quality from the laughter. The laughter had been about hierarchy, about a group of beings establishing, through social mechanism, their position relative to a newcomer they had categorized as non-threatening. The confusion was more fundamental, the genuine kind that comes from encountering a statement that doesn't fit any available framework and requires the frameworks to be revised. Explain, said the Vraxian, not rudely, with the direct demand for information of a being who had decided that the situation required more data before a position could be taken. The instructor looked at Elias. Tell them, she said. Elias took a breath. He had done this before. Not at this scale, not with this many beings, not with security drones still hovering at the periphery of his vision and a scanner still wailing its assessment of him. But the conversation itself, the specific conversation of explaining to beings who had not encountered it what the human body actually was familiar. Earth is a high-gravity world, he said, about 30% above the galactic habitable, average, dense atmosphere, complex and aggressive ecosystem, a predator environment that spent millions of years applying selection pressure to everything that lived on it. He was keeping his voice even, informational, the tone of someone giving a briefing rather than making an argument. Our bones are significantly denser than the galactic baseline for bipedal species. The density is a response to the gravity. It developed over evolutionary time as a load-bearing adaptation. As a side effect, it also makes our skeletal structure considerably more resistant to impact damage than most species our size. He looked at the nearest cadet, a Thesivian, like the one who had laughed, avian-derived, physically slight by the standards of the hall. My grip strength at baseline can cause structural damage to most species in this room. Not because I've trained it to, because the muscle density required to function in Earth's gravity produces that as a byproduct. He tapped his sternum. Our cardiovascular system produces combat hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, a handful of others, in response to threat stimuli. The production isn't voluntary, it's automatic. And the effect on our physical capability is significant. Strength increase, pain threshold increase, reaction time improvement, increased tolerance for damage. He paused. Our bodies are also built with redundancy. 2 of most major organs, distributed systems rather than centralized ones. We heal faster than most species at our biological complexity level. We can sustain significant damage and remain functional in ways that most species cannot. He looked at the scanner. That's what it's detecting. Not a weapon I'm carrying. A weapons-capable biological system that I cannot remove because it is, fundamentally, what I am. The hall was completely silent. Elias looked around it. I didn't build this, he said. My species didn't choose it. It's the result of 4 million years of evolution on a world that was trying, through every mechanism available to it, to make life difficult for anything that wanted to live there. A pause. We won. This is what winning looked like. Someone, deep in the back of the hall, voice barely audible, said, "That shouldn't be allowed." Elias smiled. It was a small smile, genuine rather than performed. "Yeah," he said. "That's been a discussion on Earth, too." The drill master was quiet for a long moment. He had been a drill master at the Galactic War Academy for 230 years. He had processed cadets from every species that the Academy accepted, had seen every variety of the first-day difficulties that young beings in a new environment with high stakes and mixed company produced, had navigated every combination of cultural misunderstanding and interpersonal friction and the various ways that the foundational rules application had needed to be explained to beings who had not previously encountered a situation where the explanation was necessary. He had not encountered this. "The rule," he said, and his voice had lost the volume of earlier without losing the weight, "exists for a reason. The Academy is neutral ground. The neutrality depends on the absence of weapons. If we create an exception, the exception, the instructor said, is the species, not the rule." She looked at Elias. "You surrendered all external equipment? Everything that falls within the standard definition of weapons or weapon systems?" "Yes, ma'am. No blades, no ranged tools, no chemical compounds, no electronic systems. Nothing that wasn't part of my body when I was born." She nodded. Looked at the drill master. "The rule covers what cadets bring," she said. "It does not cover what cadets are. These are not the same category." The scanner, she said, with the patience of someone making a point they expect to make only once, was built to detect threat profiles. A human at baseline registers as a threat profile. That is accurate. It is also not the same as carrying a weapon. She looked at Elias. "No armor?" Elias hesitated. The hesitation was brief, a fraction of a second, but it was visible. "Define armor," he said. The scanner, which had been sustaining its wail at a constant level for several minutes, spiked briefly. The instructor made a sound that was... The ambient translation systems rendered it with visible uncertainty, approximately a sigh. "Dense muscle layering providing impact resistance," she said. "Redundant organ placement providing damage tolerance. Accelerated tissue repair providing recovery speed." "Then," Elias said. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Then she waved a claw. "Accepted. Proceed." Training proceeded because the Academy had been doing what it did for 8,000 years, and the institutional momentum of 8,000 years did not stop for a conversation about biology, but the conversation continued in every other form, available to several hundred beings who had been present for something that was going to take time to fully process. In the mess hall, in careful clusters. In the dormitory corridors, in quieter pairs. In the specific back channels of species who had known each other before the academy and maintained communications outside the official framework of the training program. Not all of it was hostile. Most of it wasn't, actually. Most of it was the genuine intellectual engagement of curious beings with new information. But the hostile portion existed. The Vraxian contingent had a pride that was structural rather than chosen, built into their culture over centuries of being one of the physically dominant species in the region they came from, and the existence of something that the scanner described the way it described Elias was information that the structural pride did not receive easily. The avian cadet whose laughter had been the sharpest had not laughed since the instructors. Explanation? He had been quiet and watchful, with the quality of attention of someone revising a position they had committed to publicly and finding the revision uncomfortable. Elias, for his part, went about the first days of the academy cycle the way he went about most things, methodically. He attended every orientation session. He filed every required documentation. He introduced himself to his dormitory neighbors, with the specific quality of friendly directness that was apparently native to his region of Earth. He did not perform his biology. He did not demonstrate it, reference it unnecessarily, or use it as a social position in the way that beings sometimes use their species' particular characteristics as identity statements. He just went to training. The combat ring came on the fourth day. It was standard academy methodology, early in the cycle, before specialized training had begun. A controlled assessment exercise designed to establish baseline capability data for every cadet. The specifics varied by species pairing and physical category, but the basic structure was consistent: controlled environment, non-lethal parameters, observed and scored. The ring assignment that included Elias Rowan was, based on the intake data, a 5-on-1 configuration. Standard for species whose individual physical capability placed them in the upper assessment tiers. The 5 were selected from the top physical performers in the cohort: 2 Vraxian cadets, 1 Dravathi, 1 Thesivian, and a Peller whose species had a natural psychic disruption capability that the Academy's non-lethal parameters permitted in managed form. The observation deck was full, not because the Academy had announced the configuration specifically, because word had moved in the 4 days since processing through the informal channels, and beings who had been thinking about the conversation in the entry hall and wanted more data had found reasons to be on the observation deck that morning. Elias walked into the ring. He was wearing the standard academy training uniform. No additional equipment, the same policy as everywhere else in the facility, no external weapons, no armor supplements beyond the standard protective underlayer that all cadets wore. He stood at the center of the ring and looked at the 5 beings taking their positions around him and waited for the starting signal with the same quality of calm he had been demonstrating since the scanner screamed his arrival. The Vraxian on his left said something in his native language, below the translation threshold, to the Vraxian on the right. The one on the right made the Vraxian equivalent of a smile. The signal sounded. They came together, all 5. Simultaneously with the coordination of beings who had discussed the approach in advance and had decided that whatever the scanner said, numbers were decisive, and 5-to-1 was 5-to-1. Elias moved. Not fast, or not fast in the way that fast usually means. The explosive speed of predator response and maximum output. Precise. The specific quality of movement that comes from understanding mechanics rather than overwhelming them. Weight, balance, the physics of bodies in motion, and what happens when you redirect that motion rather than oppose it. The first Vraxian arrived with significant mass behind the approach. Elias stepped into it rather than away from it. Inside the arc of the strike, at a position that the strike's geometry hadn't accounted for. His hands went to a specific point on the Vraxian's carapace, the intersection of 2 armored plates, a natural articulation point, and applied leverage rather than force. The Vraxian went down, not violently, controlled, directed, the specific fall of something whose balance has been removed rather than whose body has been struck. The second Vraxian adjusted immediately, came from a different angle, faster this time. Elias had already moved. The Dravathi came from behind, long limbs reaching for a restraint hold. Elias didn't resist the reach, used the contact point as an anchor, rotated around it, redirected. The reaching limb threw its own momentum until the physics of the situation produced a result. That wasn't his force against the Dravathi's force, but the Dravathi's own force. Redirected, concluding the engagement. The Thasivian tried to get airborne. The ring parameters prevented full flight but allowed short lifts, and the Thasivians' training had prepared them for aerial engagement as their primary combat mode. Elias waited until the lift committed. Then he was under it. A controlled impact, not a strike, a placement, at the moment when the lift's momentum had committed to a direction and the ability to adjust was at its minimum. The Thasivian landed harder than intended, still within non-lethal parameters. Still controlled, but harder. The Peller's disruption field activated. This was the moment that the observation deck leaned forward collectively, because psychic disruption was the variable that physical analysis couldn't fully account for, and the consensus among the watching cadets had been informally that this was where the configuration's logic resided. The first four were the physical approach. The Peller was the resolution. Elias roared. It was not a strategic sound. It was not performed for the audience or calculated as a countermeasure. It was the sound of a human body under significant stress, producing the vocal output that human bodies produce under significant stress. Raw, uncontrolled, the specific frequency and intensity of a species whose evolutionary history had included, among its many elements, the need to communicate threat in environments where being heard was a survival variable. It was very loud. The Peller's disruption field required the focused concentration that psychic manipulation required, and the specific sensory input of a sound at that frequency and intensity, arriving without warning at close range, interrupted that concentration the way a sudden light interrupts vision. The Peller sat down, not injured, not in any distress beyond the interrupted focus, just briefly, completely, no longer concentrating. The ring was still. Elias stood at the center of it, breathing harder than he had been at the start. The only visible evidence that the last 90 seconds had involved significant physical output. 5 cadets in various stages of recovery around him, hands empty. The starting signal had been approximately 90 seconds ago. The silence on the observation deck lasted several seconds. Then the bell. Match concluded, the instructor said. From her position at the ring's edge, her voice was level, professional, the voice of someone who has seen things and is documenting what she has seen rather than reacting to it. Elias looked around the ring, at the 5 beings who had come in together. "You all right?" he said, to no one in particular and all of them in general. The second Vraxian, sitting up and rotating his shoulder through a range of motion check, looked at him. "What did you do to my shoulder?" "Redirected it," Elias said, "through the plate articulation. Nothing structural. You'll be sore, but not injured." The Vraxian looked at his shoulder, then at Elias. "You knew the plate articulation." "I studied the intake documentation on enrolled species before I arrived," Elias said. The Vraxian anatomical overview was in the public academic database. The Vraxian was quiet for a moment. "You studied how to fight us before you got here." "I studied," Elias said carefully, "how to avoid injuring you if I had to fight you. There's a difference. The alarm came on the 8th day. Not a training exercise. The Academy's alarm systems had 3 distinct tonal profiles, and every cadet learned them in the first 48 hours, because the distinction between this is a drill and this is not a drill was information that the Academy believed in communicating clearly. This was the 3rd profile, a containment failure in the lower training levels. The specifics moved through the cadet population in fragments and pieces, the way information moves in situations where the official communication channels are occupied with the situation itself. A live threat assessment exercise that had gone wrong in the specific way that live assessment sometimes went wrong. The controlled element becoming less controlled than the parameters had planned for. Cadets were in the corridors because the evacuation protocol directed them there. Elias was in the corridor because he was following the evacuation protocol, and then he stopped. The lower training levels were below the evacuation corridor. The assessment of went wrong that had reached him through the informal channels included a detail that the official communication had not yet confirmed. There were cadets. Still down there, Rowan. The cadet beside him, Thasivian, the one from the combat ring, who had been demonstrating since that day the quality of attention of someone revising a position, had noticed him stop. "The protocol is— I know what the protocol is," Elias said. He looked at the corridor leading down, at the corridor leading up to the designated evacuation point. "Go," he said. "Take everyone in this section. I'll be behind you." "That's not— The protocol says evacuate. It doesn't say leave. People in the lower levels." He looked at the Thasivian. "Go, please." The senior instructor arrived at the lower levels 40 minutes later, with the security response team and the situation management unit and everything else that the Academy's emergency protocols directed toward a containment failure of this type. The threat had been neutralized. This was the official assessment, based on the objective evidence available when the response team arrived. The specific threat that had constituted the failure was no longer active. The parameters that had made it dangerous had been addressed. The situation was stable. The question of how it had been stabilized, and by what, was one that the response team's after-action report would spend considerable space on. Elias Rowan was sitting against the wall of the lower-level corridor when they arrived. He had injuries. The medical assessment would catalog them as significant, but non-critical. The distinction between significant and critical in this case being largely attributable to the specific biological characteristics that the intake scanner had identified. On processing day, he was sitting against the wall and he was conscious, and when the response team's medic reached him first and began the assessment protocol, his first question was, "The cadets from the assessment exercise, are they clear?" The medic confirmed they were. Elias nodded, closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "Okay," he said. "I'm good." He was not, by the medic's assessment, good. He was injured and needed treatment, and the treatment began immediately. But he was there. Still there. That evening, the senior instructor addressed the academy. Not all of them together. The academy was large enough that full cohort addresses happened rarely, reserved for the moments that the institution judged significant enough to require them. This was one of those moments. She stood at the front of the main auditorium, looked at the gathered cadets, hundreds of beings, every species enrolled in the current cycle, the full range of what the galaxy sent to this place to be trained. Today, demonstrated something that I want to address directly, she said. Because the Academy's role is education, and education requires that we name what has been demonstrated. She was quiet for a moment. The rule of this Academy: no weapons beyond. The gate remains in effect. It will always remain in effect. It is the foundation on which everything else here rests, and it is non-negotiable. She paused. But today we were reminded of something that the rule's framers did not anticipate. That the boundary between a weapon and a being is not always clear. That what we carry and what we are not always separable. She looked briefly at the section of the auditorium where Elias was seated, away from the medical bay over his objection, present for the address because he had insisted, and the medic had been unable to provide a compelling counterargument. Cadet. Rowan walked into this academy 8 days ago and triggered every alarm we have, not because he violated the rule, because his biology could not comply with it. A pause. And then today, when the situation required someone to make a choice between following the evacuation protocol and going back, she stopped. Some of you will become officers. Some will become specialists. Some will serve in roles we haven't trained for yet because the galaxy changes faster than any curriculum. All of you will face moments when the rule and the right thing are not the same direction. She looked at the auditorium. What you do in those moments is what we are actually training for. She turned to go, then stopped. The rule remains. No weapons. Beyond the gate. A pause. but some species never needed to bring any. The scanner screamed every morning. Every morning when Elias Rowan walked through the entry gate of the Galactic War Academy on his way to the training halls. Every morning, the same peak, the same wail, the same cascading alerts that the security system produced when it encountered something that exceeded every threshold it had been configured to monitor. Every morning, and every morning, after the first 8 days, nobody tried to stop him. Not the security drones, not the on-duty instructors, not the gate personnel who had been present on processing day and had developed, through the specific process of repeated experience, the resigned familiarity with something that was always going to happen and was not, ultimately, a problem. The cadets who passed him on their way in learned to hear the scanner differently, not as an alarm, as an announcement. The Vraxian cadet who had asked him about the plate articulation had started, somewhere around the 3rd week, walking in at approximately the same time. Not because of any arrangement or schedule coordination, because the scanner's sound, when you had been in the combat ring with the being who caused it, carried information that changed the feeling of walking through those gates. The Thesivian had done the same, others gradually over the weeks that followed, not a formation, not a deliberate statement. Just beings who had updated their understanding of what a weapons-capable organism meant when it had walked into a lower level alone and come back out. At the end of the cycle, at the formal assessment that determined which cadets had met the Academy standards and which would return for additional training, the senior instructor filed her individual assessments of every cadet in the cycle. Most of them were standard format. Academy template populated with the relevant metrics from the training period. The one for Cadet Elias Rowan, Earth origin, was standard format with one addition. In the field reserved for notable characteristics relevant to deployment consideration, where most assessments noted species-specific physical or psychological traits that commanding officers should be aware of, she wrote, Cadet Rowan represents a category that the Academy's standard assessment framework does not fully capture. His physical capabilities exceed the documented baseline for his species, which itself exceeds galactic standard. His tactical reasoning is methodical and effective. His response to genuine threat conditions, as observed in the lower-level incident, demonstrates decision-making under stress that is consistent with the upper tier of the cohort across all species. The relevant characteristic for deployment consideration is not his physical capability, which is documented in the intake assessment. It is this: when given the choice between the protocol and the people, he chose the people, and when he made that choice, he did not calculate whether he would survive it. He has not, when asked about this, been able to fully explain the reasoning. He says it wasn't really a decision. In my assessment, that is the most important thing in this report. The scanner screamed every morning, and every morning, the Academy learned the same thing again, that the most dangerous thing in its halls didn't carry weapons, that it walked in through the front gate like everyone else, that it followed the rules and did its work and sat against the wall of a lower-level corridor waiting for the response team with injuries it hadn't mentioned and a question about whether the cadets were clear, that the rule was right, and that the rule had never been designed for this, and that the exception wasn't an exemption. It was a reminder that 8,000 years of knowing what a weapon was had not been enough to prepare for a species that didn't need to bring one, because they had never needed to, because they already were one, and this was the part that the scanner couldn't measure, and the assessment framework couldn't capture, and the 8,000 years of Academy history hadn't produced a category for. When they decided something was worth protecting, the weapons were the least of it.